In the quiet suburbs of Denver, Colorado, a 72-year-old retired engineer was about to celebrate what would become the most devastating birthday of her life. What started as hopeful anticipation for family gathering turned into a shocking revelation about how little she truly mattered to the people she'd sacrificed everything for. Dorothy Hansen wasn't your typical grandmother. For 45 years, she had quietly built a construction empire, while her selfish children treated her like an ATM machine. When they forgot her 72nd birthday entirely, choosing a casino trip over family celebration, she made a decision that would cost them everything. What began as birthday neglect became the most expensive lesson in gratitude they'd ever receive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Dorothy Hansen's modest ranch house on Maple Street, casting delicate patterns across the hardwood floors she'd polished to perfection the night before. At 72, Dorothy still rose with the precision of someone who'd spent 4 decades managing construction crews. 5:30 a.m. sharp, coffee brewing by 5:45, morning news by 6 o'clock. But today was different. Today was October 15th. Her birthday, and for the first time in months, she felt genuinely excited about something. The kitchen table was set for 6, each place setting featuring her grandmother's china that only emerged for special occasions. Dorothy had spent the previous evening preparing her famous pot roast, baking an apple pie from scratch, and cleaning the house until every surface gleamed. The dining room, usually reserved for holidays, was transformed with fresh flowers from her garden and candles that would cast a warm glow over what she hoped would be a perfect family gathering. Dorothy Hansen had built her life around moments like these. As the widow of Robert Hansen and mother to 4 children, Michael, Jennifer, Patricia, and Stephen, she'd spent decades orchestrating family gatherings that brought everyone together under one roof. These dinners weren't just meals. They were the glue that held the Hansen family together, the tradition that reminded everyone they belonged to something larger than themselves. The invitation had been extended 3 weeks ago, carefully planned around everyone's schedules. Michael, her eldest at 48, was a successful insurance agent who prided himself on his busy social calendar. Jennifer, 45, worked as a dental hygienist but spent most of her energy managing her twin teenage daughter's extensive extracurricular activities. Patricia, 42, had recently started a small catering business that consumed every waking moment with dreams of expansion. Stephen, the baby at 39, was a high school teacher who coached football and claimed he barely had time to breathe between seasons. Despite their busy lives, they'd all confirmed attendance. Dorothy had even received enthusiastic responses, Michael promising to bring wine, Jennifer offering to help with dessert, Patricia suggesting she could cater part of the meal as practice for her business, and Stephen assuring her he'd be there with bells on. The anticipation had carried Dorothy through weeks of careful preparation, grocery shopping with the attention to detail of someone planning a state dinner. She'd purchased the perfect pot roast from Murphy's Butcher Shop, where old Mr. Murphy still remembered her late husband's preference for well-marbled beef. The vegetables came from the farmer's market, selected with the care of someone who understood that quality ingredients made the difference between a good meal and a memorable one. She'd even driven to the specialty bakery across town to get Michael's favorite dinner rolls, the ones he'd been requesting since childhood. The house itself had undergone a transformation that would have impressed professional cleaners. Dorothy had washed windows until they sparkled like crystal, vacuumed carpets with the thoroughness of someone preparing for white glove inspection, and dusted furniture that already bore no trace of neglect. The guest bathroom was stocked with her finest hand towels, and she'd even placed small sachets of lavender in the bedrooms, a touch that made the entire house smell like a garden in spring. But the preparation went beyond cleaning and cooking. Dorothy had carefully curated conversation topics that would engage each of her children, researched their current interests, and prepared thoughtful questions about their lives. She knew about Michael's latest promotion at the insurance company, Jennifer's concerns about her daughter's college applications, Patricia's struggles with finding reliable suppliers for her catering business, and Stevens' football team's chances at the state championship. This wasn't just a birthday dinner. It was a masterclass in maternal attention to detail. The morning routine felt different because of the anticipation. Dorothy found herself humming while she prepared her coffee, a habit she'd abandoned in recent years as birthdays became increasingly solitary affairs. The excitement was almost teenage in its intensity, the kind of giddy anticipation she hadn't felt since her grandchildren were small and birthdays meant surprise parties and homemade gifts created with more love than skill. As she sipped her coffee and watched the neighborhood wake up through her kitchen window, Dorothy reflected on how much this gathering meant to her. It wasn't about the gifts, though she secretly hoped for something thoughtful that showed her children had been paying attention to her interests. It wasn't even about the attention, though she'd be lying if she said she didn't crave acknowledgement of her importance in their lives. It was about connection, the deep, sustaining bond between family members who chose to prioritize each other despite the demands of busy adult lives. The Hansen family had weathered significant storms together. Robert's sudden death from a heart attack 8 years ago had devastated everyone, but they'd rallied around Dorothy with a support that reminded her why family mattered more than anything else. Financial struggles during the children's college years had been overcome through collective sacrifice and mutual support. Career changes, relationship difficulties, health scares. All of it had been navigated with the strength that comes from knowing you're not facing life's challenges alone. Dorothy's role as family matriarch had evolved naturally over the years. After Robert's death, she'd become the central figure around whom holidays, celebrations, and family traditions revolved. Her house was the gathering place, her kitchen, the heart of family life, her wisdom, the resource everyone turned to during difficult decisions. She'd embraced this responsibility with the same dedication she'd once brought to managing construction projects: careful planning, attention to detail, and unwavering commitment to excellence. The construction business that had made the Hansen family comfortable had been built through Dorothy's business acumen as much as Robert's manual skills. While he'd focused on the physical work of building homes and commercial properties, she'd managed the financial side with precision that turned a small contracting business into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Even after retirement, Dorothy maintained oversight of investments and property management that continued generating substantial income. But money had never been the point for Dorothy. The point was legacy, creating something lasting that would benefit her children and grandchildren for generations. The wealth was simply a tool for providing security, education, and opportunities that would allow each family member to pursue their dreams without the financial constraints that had limited her own generation's choices. This birthday dinner represented more than celebration. It was validation that her life's work had meaning beyond financial success. Seeing her children gathered around her table, sharing stories and laughter, connected to each other and to her, this was the true measure of a life well lived. The anticipation of that validation, that moment of pure family joy, was what made the elaborate preparation feel effortless rather than burdensome. As the morning progressed and Dorothy began final preparations for the afternoon gathering, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've created something beautiful for people you love. The table was perfect, the food would be exceptional, and the house radiated the warmth that only comes from genuine care and attention. Everything was ready for what she believed would be one of the most meaningful birthdays of her life. She had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, this careful preparation would transform from loving gesture into heartbreaking monument to misplaced expectations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first phone call came at 11:47 a.m., just as Dorothy was pulling the pot roast from the oven to let it rest before the scheduled 2 p.m. dinner. Michael's name flashed on her phone screen, and she answered with the cheerful anticipation of someone expecting confirmation of arrival time or offers to bring additional items. "Mom, I'm so sorry." Michael's voice carried the rehearsed tone of someone who'd practiced this conversation. "Something's come up with the Carlson account. You know, the big commercial policy I've been working on for months. The client wants to meet this afternoon, and I can't reschedule. You understand how important this is for my career." Dorothy felt the first flutter of disappointment in her chest, but her response was immediate and gracious. "Of course, honey. Business comes first. We can celebrate another time." I knew you'd understand, Michael replied, relief evident in his voice. You've always been so supportive of my career. Maybe next weekend? After hanging up, Dorothy stared at the perfectly set table for 6, now requiring adjustment for 5. She removed Michael's place setting with careful movements, folding his napkin and returning his silverware to the drawer. The optimist in her suggested that 5 people would create a more intimate gathering anyway. Besides, Michael's career was important, and she'd always taught her children to prioritize their professional responsibilities. The second call came 20 minutes later, while Dorothy was arranging fresh flowers in the centerpiece vase. Jennifer's voice carried the frazzled energy of someone juggling multiple crises simultaneously. Mom, I feel terrible about this, but Emma's got a college interview that got moved to this afternoon at the last minute. It's with her first-choice school, and you know how competitive admissions are these days. I have to drive her to Boulder, and with traffic, we won't make it back in time. Dorothy's disappointment deepened, but her maternal instincts kicked in immediately. Of course you need to take her. Emma's education is the priority. I promise we'll make it up to you, Jennifer continued, her voice carrying genuine regret. Maybe we can take you out for a nice dinner next week? Just the 3 of us. You, me, and Emma? The table adjustment happened again, this time for 4 people. Dorothy found herself moving the centerpiece to better accommodate the smaller gathering, her movements efficient despite the growing hollow feeling in her stomach. 4 people could still make for a lovely celebration, she told herself. Patricia and Stephen had always been her more attentive children anyway. At 12:45 p.m., with the apple pie cooling on the counter and the dinner rolls warming in the oven, Patricia's call shattered Dorothy's determined optimism. Mom, I'm absolutely mortified. Patricia's voice carried genuine distress, but Dorothy had heard that particular tone before. The sound of someone who double-booked themselves and was trying to minimize the damage. I completely forgot that I scheduled a consultation with the Morrison wedding today. They're paying clients, and this could lead to 3 more events if I impress them. You know how hard I'm working to get the catering business off the ground. The explanation continued with details about potential contracts and career opportunities, but Dorothy found herself focusing on the phrase, quote, completely forgot. Her birthday dinner, planned for weeks with confirmed attendance, had been completely forgotten in favor of a business meeting. I understand, Dorothy heard herself saying, though she wasn't sure she understood anything anymore. Your business needs to come first. You're the best, Mom. I knew you'd get it. Maybe we can do lunch this week? 3 place settings became 2. Dorothy moved methodically through the motions of table adjustment, but something had shifted in her emotional landscape. The excitement that had sustained her through weeks of preparation was being replaced by a familiar ache. The recognition that she'd allowed herself to hope for something that was never going to materialize. Stephen's call came at 1:15 p.m., 45 minutes before the scheduled start of a dinner that was rapidly becoming a party of 1. Hey, Mom. Stephen's voice carried the easy casualness of someone who assumed forgiveness was automatic. The guys invited me to go to Black Hawk for the afternoon. You know how rarely I get to hang out with the other teachers, and it's been such a stressful week with the football season ending. Dorothy felt something cold settle in her chest. Black Hawk meant the casinos, which meant Stephen was choosing gambling with colleagues over her birthday celebration. Of all the excuses she'd heard that day, this one felt the most casual, the most dismissive of what the day meant to her. It's my birthday, Stephen, she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. I know, and I feel bad about it, Stephen replied, but his tone suggested someone going through the motions of regret rather than feeling it. But you understand, right? It's just another day, really. We can celebrate anytime. Just another day. The phrase hit Dorothy like a physical blow. 72 years of life, reduced to just another day by the son she'd supported through college, helped through his divorce, and bailed out of financial difficulties more times than she could count. Of course, Dorothy managed to say. Have fun. After Stephen hung up, Dorothy stood alone in her pristine kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of her naive optimism. The pot roast sat cooling under foil, perfectly cooked for 6 people who weren't coming. The apple pie, made from scratch with apples she'd personally selected for their perfect balance of sweet and tart, would go uneaten. The dinner rolls, purchased from the bakery 30 minutes away because they were Michael's favorites, would grow stale. The house that had buzzed with anticipatory energy all morning now felt cavernous in its silence. The dining room, transformed with flowers and candles for a celebration that would never happen, looked like a stage set for a play that had been canceled without notice. The careful attention to detail, the polished silverware, the pressed napkins, the precisely arranged place settings now felt like evidence of her own foolishness. Dorothy walked slowly through the rooms she'd prepared with such care, seeing them now through different eyes. The guest bathroom stocked with fancy hand towels for visitors who wouldn't come. The living room vacuumed and dusted for a gathering that existed only in her imagination. The flower arrangements that would wilt unappreciated, like her own expectations. She found herself in her bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed where she'd laid out her best dress that morning. The navy blue one with the pearl buttons that Robert had always said brought out her eyes. The dress now seemed foolish, overdressed for a party of one. She changed into comfortable clothes, hanging the dress back in the closet with movements that felt like taking down decorations after a canceled celebration. The kitchen drew her back like a magnet, if only because the evidence of her preparation demanded attention. The pot roast needed to be properly stored, the pie covered, the rolls put away. As she moved through these domestic tasks, Dorothy found herself replaying each phone call, analyzing the tone and timing that had systematically dismantled her birthday celebration. What struck her wasn't just the individual cancellations, but their casual nature. 4 separate people had made other plans, forgotten commitments, or simply chosen other activities over her birthday. This wasn't a case of genuine emergencies or unavoidable conflicts. These were choices. Michael's client meeting could have been scheduled for Monday. Jennifer's daughter's interview was important, but surely not every college interview required maternal transportation. Patricia had completely forgotten the birthday she'd confirmed attending just days earlier. Stephen had chosen casino gambling over family celebration. The pattern revealed something Dorothy had been reluctant to acknowledge. She had become optional in her children's lives, not essential, not prioritized, not even particularly considered. She was the reliable constant they could take for granted, because she'd always been understanding, always been accommodating, always put their needs before her own expectations. As afternoon sunlight slanted through her kitchen windows, illuminating the untouched feast she'd prepared, Dorothy began to see her situation with clarity that was as painful as it was revealing. This wasn't just about a forgotten birthday. It was about a fundamental lack of respect for her time, her efforts, and her feelings. 4 adult children had decided that their wants were more important than her needs, their convenience more valuable than her celebration. The realization settled over her like cold water, washing away the last traces of disappointed hope and replacing them with something harder and more crystalline. For the first time in years, Dorothy Hansen began to see her family relationships as they actually were, rather than as she'd wanted them to be. The silence that filled Dorothy's house after the last cancellation call wasn't just empty, it was heavy with the weight of accumulated years. As she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the untouched birthday feast, memories began surfacing with the relentless precision of an audit. For the first time in decades, Dorothy Hansen allowed herself to examine the true ledger of her family relationships. She found herself walking to the hallway closet where she kept her photo albums, thick volumes that documented 40 years of family life. The albums were meticulously organized. Dorothy's engineering mind had insisted on chronological order, detailed captions, and careful preservation of every significant moment. Now, as she carried the first album back to the kitchen table, she wondered what story these images would actually tell. The earliest photos showed a young Dorothy with baby Michael, her face glowing with new mother pride. But as she flipped through the pages, a pattern emerged that she'd never noticed before. Birthday parties where Dorothy appeared exhausted from preparation, while others enjoyed the celebration. Christmas mornings where she was barely visible behind the camera, documenting everyone else's joy. School events where she stood at the edges of group photos, present, but peripheral. Page after page revealed the same dynamic. Dorothy as the invisible orchestrator of other people's happiness. She was the one taking the pictures, not appearing in them. She was the one cleaning up after parties, not relaxing during them. She was the one making everything possible while everyone else simply enjoyed the results. Michael's graduation from college brought back a particularly sharp memory. Dorothy had worked double shifts at the construction company for months to cover his tuition when a scholarship fell through. She'd attended every parents' weekend, every ceremony, every celebration. The photo from graduation day showed Michael beaming in his cap and gown, surrounded by friends and professors. Dorothy appeared in only one picture, standing slightly apart, holding his diploma while he posed with his girlfriend. After graduation, Michael had promised to take her out for a, quote, proper celebration dinner to thank her for her sacrifices. That dinner never happened. He'd gotten busy with job interviews, then a new position, then training programs. The thank you dinner became soon, then next month, then something that simply faded into the background of his increasingly complex adult life. Jennifer's wedding album told a similar story. Dorothy had paid for the dress, the flowers, half of the reception costs. She'd spent weeks addressing invitations, coordinating with vendors, managing details that Jennifer was too busy to handle. The wedding photos showed a beautiful bride, a handsome groom, an elegant reception. Dorothy appeared in the required family photos, smiling and appropriate, but the candid shots told a different story. Images of her cleaning up, spilled wine, collecting abandoned plates, managing crises while others danced. The promised repayment for wedding expenses had never materialized. Jennifer had explained that starting married life was expensive, that they needed time to get established. Dorothy had understood and never mentioned the money again. The debt had simply been absorbed into the larger pattern of Dorothy's financial support, flowing in one direction only. Patricia's business venture memories were particularly painful to revisit. When Patricia had announced her dream of starting a catering company, Dorothy had been her first and most enthusiastic supporter. She'd co-signed loans when banks deemed Patricia too risky. She'd provided startup capital when investors declined to fund the venture. She'd used her construction industry contacts to arrange Patricia's first few events. The photo from Patricia's first successful catering job showed her daughter radiant with accomplishment, surrounded by satisfied clients and elegant food displays. Dorothy wasn't in that photo. She'd been in the kitchen, washing dishes and cleaning up, making the magic possible from behind the scenes. Patricia had promised that once the business was established, Dorothy would be properly credited and compensated for her crucial early support. That recognition never came. As the business grew successful, Dorothy's contributions faded into forgotten history. Stephen's football coaching career had followed the same pattern. When budget cuts threatened to eliminate the assistant coaching position he wanted, Dorothy had quietly donated money to the athletic department to ensure the position remained funded. When Stephen needed equipment for his team that the school couldn't afford, Dorothy had purchased it anonymously through the Booster Club. When his marriage fell apart and he needed legal help he couldn't afford, Dorothy had covered the attorney fees without question. The pattern was clear in every album, every set of memories. Dorothy giving, supporting, enabling, and facilitating, while receiving only the most casual acknowledgement in return. Her children had learned to expect her support as automatically as they expected sunrise. They'd learned that their needs would always be met, their crises solved, their dreams funded, without reciprocal obligation or even sustained gratitude. As afternoon shadows lengthened across her kitchen floor, Dorothy realized she was looking at the documentation of a fundamental failure in how she'd raised her children. Not a failure of love. She'd loved them fiercely and completely, not a failure of provision. She'd given them every opportunity and advantage she could afford. The failure was in teaching them that love was supposed to flow in both directions, that family relationships required mutual consideration and respect. She'd created a dynamic where her role was to serve and their role was to receive. They'd learned this lesson so thoroughly that they now operated from the assumption that her time, energy, and resources existed primarily for their benefit. Her birthday had been forgotten not through malice, but through the casual disregard that comes from taking someone completely for granted. The construction business that had provided the family's financial security told its own story of Dorothy's invisible contributions. While Robert had been the face of Hansen Construction, Dorothy had managed every aspect of the business that required precision and planning. She'd handled payroll, managed subcontractors, negotiated contracts, and maintained the financial systems that kept the company profitable year after year. When Robert died, the children had assumed the business would simply continue running itself. They'd been shocked to discover that Dorothy was the operational heart of the enterprise, that her bookkeeping actually encompassed strategic planning, financial management, and operational oversight that required expertise accumulated over decades. Even then, their response had been telling. Instead of recognizing Dorothy's crucial role and business acumen, they'd suggested hiring a real business manager to handle the complex aspects of the company. The assumption was that Dorothy's contributions, however essential, were somehow less legitimate than those of a professional outsider. The photo albums also revealed another uncomfortable truth. Her children's presence at family events had become increasingly perfunctory over the years. Recent holiday photos showed them checking phones during dinner, leaving early for other commitments, or appearing distracted even during special occasions. They'd learned to show up physically while remaining emotionally absent, fulfilling the minimum requirements of family participation without genuine engagement. Dorothy found herself studying a photo from last Christmas, taken just 10 months ago. She was serving dinner while Michael scrolled through his phone, Jennifer texted with someone about her daughter's activities, Patricia took business calls during dessert, and Stephen checked sports scores on his tablet. The image captured the reality of modern family gatherings, Dorothy creating connection while everyone else prioritized outside distractions. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. She had spent decades enabling a family dynamic that treated her as a resource rather than a person. Her children had learned that they could make demands without making efforts, receive benefits without reciprocating consideration, and count on her support without offering their own. But the photo albums revealed something else that sent a chill through Dorothy's chest. Recent family events where her absence wouldn't have significantly changed anything. Gatherings where her role had been reduced to providing food and location while everyone else interacted around her rather than with her. She'd become the furniture of family life, essential for function but invisible as a person with her own needs and feelings. The realization that crystallized as she closed the last photo album was perhaps the most painful of all. Her children didn't just take her for granted, they'd learned to see her as fundamentally less important than they were. Their time was valuable, hers was infinite. Their commitments were serious, hers were flexible. Their needs were legitimate, hers were optional. This birthday wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a relationship dynamic she'd unknowingly fostered for decades. The question that emerged from this painful self-examination wasn't why they'd chosen other activities over her birthday, but why she'd ever believed they wouldn't. As evening approached and the untouched birthday dinner grew cold, Dorothy Hansen sat surrounded by the evidence of a life spent loving people who'd learned to love themselves more. As the evening shadows stretched across Dorothy's kitchen floor, transforming her untouched birthday feast into something resembling a shrine to misplaced hope, she found herself drawn to her home office. The small room adjoining the kitchen had been Robert's domain during his lifetime, filled with construction blueprints and project files. After his death, Dorothy had transformed it into her private sanctuary, a place where she managed the complex financial empire that her children didn't even know existed. The filing cabinets that lined the walls contained more than family photos and sentimental documents. Behind the innocent facade of household organization lay the carefully maintained records of Dorothy's true life's work. The systematic transformation of Hansen Construction, from a modest contracting business into a diversified investment portfolio worth over $12 million. Dorothy unlocked the bottom drawer of her desk and withdrew a leather portfolio that had never been seen by anyone outside her financial advisor's office. The documents inside told a story of strategic brilliance that would have impressed the most sophisticated investors. While her children assumed she was simply keeping the books after Robert's death, Dorothy had been orchestrating one of the most successful business transformations in Denver's construction industry. The original Hansen Construction had been profitable but limited in scope, a small company that built custom homes and handled modest commercial projects. Robert's death could have meant the end of the business, but Dorothy had seen opportunity where others saw crisis. Using her engineering background and 4 decades of industry knowledge, she'd systematically sold off the labor-intensive construction operations and reinvested the proceeds into commercial real estate, equipment leasing, and strategic partnerships. The first major transaction had been the sale of the construction equipment to a larger contractor, netting $800,000 that Dorothy immediately invested in a downtown Denver office building. The building had appreciated 340% over 8 years while generating steady rental income. The second transformation involved converting Hansen Construction's client relationships into consulting contracts, where Dorothy's expertise in project management and cost estimation commanded premium fees without the overhead of maintaining crews and equipment. But the real genius lay in Dorothy's diversification strategy. The portfolio now included rental properties across 3 states, equipment leasing contracts with major construction firms, mineral rights in Colorado and Wyoming, and carefully selected stock investments in construction and engineering companies. What had begun as a family business worth perhaps $400,000 had become an investment empire that generated over $60,000 monthly in passive income. The financial statements Dorothy reviewed told a story her children would never have believed: monthly income that exceeded what most families earned annually. Asset appreciation that had outperformed the stock market for 7 consecutive years. Cash reserves that could fund multiple luxury lifestyles without touching the principal investments. Dorothy Hansen wasn't just comfortable, she was wealthy enough to change lives with the stroke of a pen. The irony wasn't lost on her as she studied the latest quarterly reports. While her children worried about mortgage payments, college tuition, and business expenses, Dorothy sat on liquid assets that could have solved every financial concern any of them had ever mentioned. Michael's insurance agency could be purchased outright. Jennifer's daughters could attend any college in the country without student loans. Patricia's catering business could expand into a restaurant empire. Stephen could retire from teaching and pursue any passion he desired. But Dorothy had learned from Robert's experience with his own inheritance. His father had left him a modest sum when he died, and Robert had shared it immediately with his siblings out of generosity and family loyalty. The money had been spent within 2 years, wasted on poor investments, luxury purchases, and lifestyle inflation that left everyone no better off than before. Robert had sworn that if he ever had wealth to pass on, he'd ensure it went to people who understood its value. Dorothy had honored that commitment by requiring her children to demonstrate financial responsibility before gaining access to family wealth. She'd watched for signs of maturity, wisdom, and gratitude that would indicate they were ready for significant inheritance. The signs never came. Instead, she'd witnessed increasing entitlement, casual disregard for money, and assumptions that financial support was their birthright rather than her choice. The desk drawer also contained something that would have shocked her children even more than the financial statements: a detailed record of every dollar Dorothy had given them over the years. The engineering precision that had made her successful in business extended to her personal record-keeping. Every loan, every gift, every paid expense was documented with dates, amounts, and circumstances. Michael's file alone contained over $180,000 in documented support: college tuition assistance, down payment help for his house, car repairs, insurance premiums when his business was struggling, even groceries charged to Dorothy's account when his cash flow was tight. The pattern showed steady financial dependence disguised as temporary assistance. Loans that were never repaid, gifts that were never acknowledged, support that was never reciprocated. Jennifer's documentation was equally revealing. Beyond the wedding expenses that had never been repaid, Dorothy had covered medical bills, car payments, children's clothing and equipment, and countless emergency expenses that seemed to occur with suspicious regularity. The total exceeded $150,000, not including the informal cash gifts that Dorothy had stopped tracking after realizing they were simply expected rather than appreciated. Patricia's business support had been the most substantial, totaling nearly $200,000 in loans, guarantees, equipment purchases, and operational subsidies. The catering company that Patricia proudly claimed as her own success was built on a foundation of Dorothy's investment. Yet Patricia had never offered to formalize their business relationship, provide Dorothy with ownership equity, or even acknowledge her mother's crucial role in the company's success. Stephen's file contained the most recent entries, documenting everything from divorce attorney fees to coaching equipment to the new truck he'd needed when his old one broke down. The support totaled $95,000 over just 3 years, including a $15,000 loan for gambling debts that Stephen had acquired during previous casino trips with his teaching colleagues. The grand total was staggering, over $625,000 in documented financial support, provided to 4 children who consistently treated Dorothy as if she were financially dependent on their consideration rather than the reverse. They'd learned to see her as someone who needed their attention and time, rather than someone who'd been quietly funding their lifestyles for decades. Dorothy pulled out another document that none of her children had ever seen, her current will and estate plan. The document, updated just 6 months ago, divided her estate equally among her 4 children, with additional provisions for grandchildren's education and various charitable donations. It was the standard approach of a loving mother who wanted to provide for her family's future security. But as Dorothy read through the will's provisions, she saw them differently now. The document represented the assumption that her children would eventually mature into the kind of people who deserved significant inheritance. It was written for the children she'd hoped they'd become, not the adults they'd actually grown into. The estate plan included provisions for the continuation of Hansen Construction's investment operations, with detailed instructions for maintaining the income streams and asset appreciation that had built the family's wealth. Dorothy had assumed her children would want to understand and preserve the financial legacy she'd built. Now she wondered if they'd simply liquidate everything for immediate gratification, destroying decades of careful wealth building for short-term consumption. The most telling document in the file was a letter Dorothy had written to her children, but never sent. Composed after Robert's funeral, it explained the true scope of the family's financial position and outlined Dorothy's hopes for how the wealth might be used to create lasting, positive impact. The letter expressed her desire to see her children become thoughtful stewards of the resources they'd inherit, using their good fortune to serve others and strengthen their community. Reading the letter now, Dorothy felt the gap between her hopes and reality with painful clarity. The children described in the letter were generous, responsible, and grateful people who would honor the family's legacy through their own character and choices. The children who'd canceled her birthday dinner were none of those things. As she returned the documents to their secure filing system, Dorothy realized she'd been living in 2 different realities simultaneously. In one reality, she was the struggling widow whose children occasionally helped when they had time. In the other reality, she was a wealthy woman whose ungrateful children took her financial support for granted, while treating her personal needs as optional. The birthday dinner cancellations had forced these 2 realities to collide, revealing the truth that Dorothy had been avoiding for years. Her children's love was conditional on her usefulness, and her usefulness was predicated on giving without receiving. They'd learned to extract maximum benefit from the relationship while providing minimum consideration in return. The question that crystallized as Dorothy locked away the evidence of her hidden empire wasn't whether her children deserved the inheritance she'd planned to leave them. The question was whether providing that inheritance would serve any purpose other than enabling their continued selfishness and ingratitude. Dorothy's birthday passed into evening without a single phone call checking on her well-being. As the clock struck 9 p.m., she realized that not one of her 4 children had bothered to call back, send a text, or make any gesture acknowledging that they'd left their 72-year-old mother completely alone on her birthday. The silence wasn't just disappointing, it was revealing. It demonstrated that once they'd secured permission for their own plans, her experience ceased to matter to them entirely. She was washing the untouched dishes from her elaborate dinner preparation when her phone finally rang. For a moment, hope flickered that one of her children had remembered their thoughtlessness and was calling to apologize or at least check on her. Instead, the caller ID showed unknown number, a telemarketer who'd somehow obtained her number despite being on every do-not-call list available. The irony was crushing. On her 72nd birthday, the only person who wanted to talk to Dorothy Hansen was a stranger trying to sell her something she didn't need. She declined the call and returned to cleaning up the evidence of her naive expectations, each dish she washed feeling like a small burial of hope. But as Dorothy dried the last of her grandmother's china and returned it to the cabinet where it would wait for the next special occasion that might never come, something unexpected happened. Instead of the crushing sadness she'd anticipated, a different emotion began emerging from the depths of her disappointment. Anger. Not the hot, explosive anger of temporary frustration, but the cold, calculated anger of someone who'd finally seen the truth clearly. The anger wasn't directed at the birthday cancellations themselves. Those were just symptoms of a much larger problem. The anger was directed at herself, for enabling a family dynamic that had taught her children she was disposable. For decades, she'd accepted crumbs of attention and called them love. She'd excused selfish behavior as busy schedules. She'd rationalized neglect as generational differences. She'd been a willing participant in her own diminishment. Dorothy found herself standing in her living room, looking at family photos that suddenly seemed like evidence of an elaborate delusion. Picture after picture showed her smiling alongside children who'd learned to see her as a service provider rather than a person deserving of consideration. She'd been so focused on being the perfect mother that she'd forgotten to teach them how to be decent human beings. The phone rang again at 9:47 p.m., and this time Dorothy felt a surge of vindictive satisfaction when she saw Stephen's name on the caller ID. Finally, one of them had remembered that they'd abandoned their mother on her birthday. She answered with cool formality. "Hi, Mom." Stephen's voice carried the artificial cheerfulness of someone who'd been drinking and was overcompensating for guilt. "Just wanted to check in and see how your day went." The casual question, delivered as if he'd had no role in how her day had actually gone, struck Dorothy as so absurd that she almost laughed. "My day was very quiet," she replied, her voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "That's great. Sometimes quiet days are the best days, right?" Stephen continued, apparently oblivious to the tone shift. "We had an amazing time at Blackhawk. I actually won $300 on the slots. Can you believe it?" Dorothy could hear casino sounds in the background. The electronic chiming of slot machines. Laughter from Stephen's teaching colleagues. The general atmosphere of people having the kind of fun that had been more important to her son than spending time with her on her birthday. The contrast between his excitement about his gambling winnings and his complete lack of awareness about her emotional state was breathtaking. "That's wonderful for you," Dorothy said, her voice carrying an edge that Stephen was too intoxicated to notice. "Yeah, it really turned out to be a perfect day," Stephen continued. "Sometimes you just need to get away from routine and do something spontaneous, you know? Anyway, I hope you had a nice relaxing day at home." The phrase perfect day was the breaking point. Stephen had experienced a perfect day by abandoning his mother on her birthday, and he was calling to share his joy about it without a trace of self-awareness about what that revealed about his character. "Stephen," Dorothy said quietly, "do you know what today was?" "What do you mean?" he asked, and Dorothy could hear him moving away from the casino noise, perhaps beginning to sense that something was wrong. "Today was October 15th. My birthday. The birthday dinner you confirmed attending 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of Stephen's world shifting as he realized the magnitude of his thoughtlessness. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its cheerful intoxication and taken on the defensive tone of someone who knew they'd been caught in inexcusable behavior. "Oh God, Mom, I thought that was next weekend. The casino thing just came up so suddenly, and Stephen," Dorothy interrupted, "you didn't forget the date. You chose something more appealing and decided I would understand. Just like Michael chose a business meeting, Jennifer chose her daughter's interview, and Patricia chose a client consultation. But Mom, you always understand. You've always been so flexible about these things." The words confirmed everything Dorothy had realized about the family dynamic she'd unknowingly created. She'd been so understanding, so flexible, so accommodating, that her children had learned her feelings were infinitely negotiable while theirs were absolutely sacred. "You're right," Dorothy said, her voice carrying a calmness that would have alarmed Stephen if he'd been sober enough to recognize it. "I have always understood. I've understood that your plans matter more than mine. I've understood that your time is valuable while mine is disposable. I've understood that your needs are legitimate while mine are optional. Mom, we don't think of it that way." "How do you think of it, Stephen? How do you rationalize leaving your 72-year-old mother alone on her birthday so you can gamble with your friends?" Stephen's attempts at explanation devolved into the incoherent justifications of someone who'd never been forced to examine their behavior before. He talked about stress, about needing downtime, about assuming they could celebrate anytime. Each excuse revealed the fundamental selfishness that had been masked by Dorothy's endless accommodation. "We'll make it up to you," Stephen finally said, falling back on the standard family promise that had never been kept. "Maybe next weekend we can all get together and have a proper celebration." "No," Dorothy said simply. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. In 39 years of being Stephen's mother, Dorothy had never refused his requests for understanding, forgiveness, or second chances. The finality in her voice was foreign to both of them. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no more making it up to me. No more promises for next time. No more assuming I'll always understand and accommodate your choices. I'm done being the family member whose feelings matter least." Stephen's protests became increasingly frantic as he realized he was dealing with a version of his mother he'd never encountered before. This wasn't the predictably forgiving woman who'd absorbed decades of casual neglect with patient grace. This was someone who'd reached a breaking point and wasn't interested in familiar patterns of apology and repetition. Dorothy ended the call, while Stephen was still trying to negotiate his way back to her usual understanding. She turned off her phone and sat in the silence of her living room, feeling the strange liberation that comes from finally saying no to people who'd never learned to hear that word from her. The anger that had begun as a flicker was now a steady flame, not the destructive kind that burned everything around it, but the clarifying kind that illuminated exactly what needed to change. Dorothy Hansen had spent 72 years learning to accommodate other people's selfishness. Tonight, she began learning something completely different: the power that comes from refusing to be taken for granted. For the first time in decades, Dorothy felt truly awake. The birthday that had begun with hopeful anticipation and descended into painful revelation was ending with something she hadn't experienced in years: the absolute certainty that she deserved better than what she'd been accepting. The question was no longer why her children treated her as optional. The question was what she intended to do about it. Dorothy woke the next morning with the mental clarity that sometimes follows life-altering realizations. The fog of disappointment and self-doubt that had clouded her thinking for years had lifted, replaced by the sharp focus she'd once brought to complex engineering problems. As she prepared her coffee in the kitchen where yesterday's birthday disaster had unfolded, Dorothy found herself approaching her family situation with the same analytical precision that had built her financial empire. The first step was gathering intelligence. Dorothy spent the morning systematically reviewing her children's recent social media posts, something she'd rarely done before out of respect for their privacy. What she discovered was both illuminating and infuriating. Michael's Facebook page was filled with photos from expensive restaurants, luxury vacations, and social events that suggested a lifestyle far beyond what his insurance income should support. The timestamps on many posts coincided with periods when he'd been asking Dorothy for temporary financial assistance. Jennifer's Instagram revealed a similar pattern: designer handbags, spa days, her daughter's expensive extracurricular activities, and frequent shopping trips to high-end boutiques. The most recent post, uploaded just hours after she'd canceled Dorothy's birthday dinner for Emma's emergency college interview, showed Jennifer and Emma at a Nordstrom sale, laden with shopping bags and grinning for selfies. The college interview had apparently concluded with a mother-daughter shopping spree funded by credit cards that Dorothy's previous financial gifts had helped them obtain. Patricia's business social media presence was particularly galling. Her catering company's website prominently featured testimonials about her self-made success and bootstrapped entrepreneurship. Press releases described her as a visionary business owner who built her company from nothing through determination and hard work. There was no mention of Dorothy's crucial financial backing, co-signed loans, or the industry connections that had launched Patricia's career. Dorothy's contributions had been erased from the story of her daughter's success. Stephen's online presence showed photos from the previous night's casino trip, including images of him celebrating his slot machine winnings with colleagues who apparently had no idea he'd abandoned his mother's birthday to join them. The posts were tagged with phrases like, "living my best life," and "sometimes you just gotta treat yourself." The lack of awareness was staggering. But the most revealing discovery came when Dorothy found a group text thread that Jennifer had screenshot and posted to her private story. a conversation between all four siblings about managing mom's expectations as she got older. The messages, which Dorothy accessed through her granddaughter Emma's account that still shared family photos with her, provided a window into how her children actually viewed her. Michael had written, "We need to be realistic about mom's social needs, without letting her become too demanding of our time." Jennifer had added, "She's always been clingy, but it's getting worse. We can't be expected to drop everything every time she wants family dinner." Patricia's contribution was even more callous. "The birthday thing is just guilt manipulation. She knows we're busy adults with real responsibilities." Stephen's response had been the most hurtful. "Mom doesn't understand that we have actual lives now. She needs to find her own interests, instead of making us her whole social calendar." The thread continued, with discussions about setting boundaries, and not enabling her dependence on family attention. The conversation revealed that Dorothy's children had collectively decided she was the problem. In their narrative, she was an increasingly needy elderly woman who made unreasonable demands on their precious time. They'd reframed her desire for family connection as emotional manipulation and her disappointment as selfish expectation. The birthday dinner hadn't been forgotten or deprioritized. It had been deliberately dismissed as an illegitimate claim on their attention. Dorothy set down her phone and walked to her office, her engineering mind already formulating a response strategy. For 40 years in construction, she'd dealt with contractors who took advantage of clients, suppliers who inflated costs, and partners who claimed credit for work they hadn't done. She'd learned that the only language some people understood was consequences that affected their bottom line. Her financial records told a story that would shock her children into reality. The monthly support she provided wasn't just generous gifts, it was the foundation that made their current lifestyles possible. Michael's mortgage payments were manageable only because Dorothy had provided his down payment and continued to cover his property taxes. Jennifer's daughters attended private school because Dorothy quietly paid the tuition bills that Jennifer's family couldn't afford. Patricia's catering business operated out of a commercial kitchen that Dorothy owned and let Patricia use rent-free. Stephen's comfortable teacher's salary was supplemented by regular cash gifts that Dorothy provided for his car payments, insurance, and the gambling debts he thought she didn't know about. But Dorothy's support went far beyond direct financial assistance. Her ownership of rental properties provided discounted housing for 2 of her children. Her business connections had secured jobs and contracts for family members throughout the years. Her excellent credit had co-signed loans that her children's financial irresponsibility would never have qualified for independently. The web of support was so extensive and quietly managed that her children had no idea how dependent they actually were on her continued generosity. Dorothy opened her laptop and began creating a detailed spreadsheet, something she hadn't done since her active business days, but muscle memory made the process automatic. Column by column, she documented every form of support she currently provided to each child: direct payments, subsidized expenses, co-signed obligations, property arrangements, and informal assistance. The totals were staggering. Michael received approximately $3,800 monthly in various forms of support. Jennifer's family benefited from $4,200 in monthly assistance. Patricia's business operations were subsidized to the tune of $2,900 monthly. Stephen received the least direct support at $1,800 monthly, but that figure didn't include the gambling debts Dorothy had quietly paid off, or the emergency loans she'd provided during his divorce. The total monthly support Dorothy provided to her 4 children exceeded $12,700 more than many families earned in gross income. Over the course of a year, she was essentially funding a 6-figure lifestyle enhancement for people who treated her birthday as optional. But the most interesting column in Dorothy's spreadsheet was the one labeled Legal Obligations. Unlike gifts or informal assistance, several of Dorothy's support arrangements created binding financial relationships. She was the primary account holder on credit cards her children used. She was the co-signer on loans that required her approval for major changes. She owned properties that her children occupied or used for business purposes. She held the controlling interests in investment accounts that generated income her children had learned to depend on. Dorothy realized she didn't just support her children's lifestyles, She controlled the infrastructure that made their current lives possible. With a few phone calls and legal documents, she could fundamentally alter their financial reality in ways they'd never anticipated. The strategic options were numerous and devastating. She could cancel the credit cards, call in the loans, reclaim the properties, and terminate the investment income streams that her children had learned to count on as automatically as sunrise. She could do this legally, immediately, and without warning, just as they had canceled her birthday without warning. But Dorothy's mind was moving beyond simple retaliation toward something more sophisticated. A comprehensive restructuring of family relationships that would force her children to confront the reality of their dependence and the consequences of their ingratitude. She wasn't interested in punishing them out of spite. She was interested in educating them about the value of relationships they'd learned to take for granted. The phone rang while Dorothy was calculating the financial impact of various strategic options. Patricia's name appeared on the caller ID, and Dorothy answered with cool professionalism. "Hi, Mom," Patricia said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who'd heard about the previous night's conversation with Stephen. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing today." "I'm doing very well," Dorothy replied truthfully. "I'm working on some financial planning projects." "That's good," Patricia said uncertainly. "Stephen mentioned you seemed upset about yesterday. I hope you know we all feel terrible about the scheduling conflicts." The phrase, scheduling conflicts, was perfectly chosen to minimize their deliberate choices into unfortunate circumstances beyond their control. Dorothy felt a familiar surge of the analytical anger that had made her formidable in business negotiations. "Patricia," Dorothy said calmly, "I'm curious about something. How do you think your catering business would fare if you had to pay market-rate rent for your commercial kitchen space?" The question landed like a physical blow. Patricia's silence stretched long enough to confirm that she understood the implications of what Dorothy was asking. "Mom," Patricia finally said, her voice small, "what are you saying?" "I'm not saying anything yet," Dorothy replied. "I'm just thinking about fair market relationships and what they might look like." The call ended shortly afterward, with Patricia making vague promises about better communication and family consideration. But Dorothy could hear the fear in her daughter's voice. The dawning realization that the mother they'd taken for granted might not be as powerless as they'd assumed. Dorothy returned to her spreadsheet with renewed focus. Her children had taught her that love without boundaries was indistinguishable from weakness. Now it was time for them to learn what boundaries actually looked like when enforced by someone who held all the economic cards they'd forgotten she was dealing. Dorothy's phone began ringing at 7:32 a.m. on the third day after her birthday disaster. Michael's name appeared on the screen, but when she answered, she could hear multiple voices in the background, the unmistakable sound of a conference call that had been planned without her knowledge. "Mom," Michael said with the forced authority of someone trying to control a situation that was slipping away from him, "we need to have a family meeting. Today, we're all concerned about your recent behavior and we think we should clear the air before things get out of hand." Dorothy almost smiled at the phrase, recent behavior. In their narrative, she was the one whose behavior had become problematic, not the four adults who'd abandoned their mother on her birthday and then mocked her emotional needs in group text messages. "What recent behavior concerns you?" Dorothy asked with genuine curiosity. "Well," Jennifer's voice chimed in from the background, "Stephen said you were really harsh with him the other night. And Patricia mentioned you made some strange comments about business arrangements. We're worried you might be going through something." The euphemism, going through something, was code for what Dorothy's children clearly suspected. That their 72-year-old mother was having some sort of emotional breakdown that required family intervention. The irony was exquisite. They'd treated her terribly and were now concerned that she might not accept that treatment gracefully. "I see," Dorothy said. "And you've all discussed this together?" "We're just trying to understand what's happening," Michael replied, his voice carrying the patient tone one might use with a confused elderly person. "Your expectations seem to have changed suddenly, and we want to make sure we're all on the same page about family dynamics going forward." Dorothy recognized the corporate speak that Michael had learned in his insurance training. He was trying to manage her like a difficult client who needed to be handled with a combination of authority and patronizing kindness. The approach might have worked on the woman she'd been a week ago, but that woman no longer existed. I think a family meeting is an excellent idea, Dorothy said, surprising them with her agreement. But it should be at my house, and we should discuss some financial matters that affect everyone. The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken concerns. Dorothy's mention of financial matters had clearly triggered alarm bells among her children, who'd spent years carefully avoiding any detailed discussion of money beyond their periodic requests for assistance. Financial matters? Patricia's voice was carefully neutral, but Dorothy could hear the anxiety underneath. Yes. I've been reviewing our family's financial arrangements, and I think it's time for more transparency about how money flows between us. Since you're all concerned about my behavior, perhaps we should examine whether my financial behavior has been appropriate as well. Another silence, this one longer and more uncomfortable. Dorothy had turned their intervention strategy against them by suggesting that she might be the one with concerns about the family's financial dynamics. Mom, Stephen's voice joined the conversation, carrying the hangover roughness of someone who'd spent another evening at the casino. I don't think we need to make this about money. We just want to make sure you're okay emotionally. Stephen, did you know that I've provided you with approximately $95,000 in various forms of financial assistance over the past 3 years? Dorothy asked conversationally. The question landed like a bomb in the middle of their carefully orchestrated intervention. Stephen's shocked silence was audible even through the phone connection. I have detailed records, Dorothy continued pleasantly. Legal fees, car payments, credit card balances, emergency loans, that unfortunate gambling debt you thought I didn't know about. I think $95,000 qualifies as a financial matter worth discussing, don't you? Mom, Michael interrupted, his voice tight with new anxiety. Where is this coming from? You've never kept score like this before. I've always kept score, Michael. I just never shared the totals. But since we're having a family meeting about behavioral concerns, I thought we should review everyone's behavior comprehensively. Dorothy could hear frantic whispering in the background, as her children tried to figure out how their planned intervention had become a financial audit. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that they were now the ones feeling defensive. Look, Jennifer said, attempting to regain control of the conversation. We can talk about money if you want to, but the main thing is that we're worried about you. This isn't like you, Mom. You've always been understanding about our busy schedules. You're absolutely right, Dorothy agreed. I have always been understanding. Perhaps too understanding. That's definitely something we should discuss in person. They agreed to meet at Dorothy's house at 2 p.m., with Dorothy insisting that everyone attend in person rather than allowing anyone to participate by phone. She wanted to see their faces when she presented the information she'd been compiling. Dorothy spent the morning preparing for the meeting with the same meticulous attention she'd once brought to major construction negotiations. She printed financial summaries for each child, compiled documentation of her various support arrangements, and organized everything into neat folders that she placed around her dining room table, the same table where she'd planned to celebrate her birthday just 3 days earlier. But this time, the table setting told a different story. Instead of china and flowers, each place setting featured a manila folder containing information that would force her children to confront the reality of their financial dependence. Dorothy had transformed her dining room into a boardroom where the family's economic relationships would finally be discussed openly. Michael and Jennifer arrived first, both looking uncomfortable in a way Dorothy had never seen before. They were used to visiting their mother as supplicants seeking assistance or as busy adults squeezing in obligatory family time. They'd never been summoned to account for their behavior or justify their treatment of her. Mom, Jennifer said as she noticed the formal folder arrangement, this looks pretty serious. It is serious, Dorothy replied calmly. Please have a seat. We'll wait for Patricia and Stephen. Patricia arrived precisely on time, her usual confidence noticeably diminished since their phone conversation. She glanced nervously at the folders and chose a seat that put her closest to the exit, a detail that didn't escape Dorothy's notice. Stephen was 15 minutes late, arriving with the sheepish expression of someone who'd been hoping the meeting might be canceled or forgotten. He slid into the remaining chair with the resignation of someone facing an inevitable reckoning. Thank you all for coming, Dorothy began with the formal tone she'd once used for construction company board meetings. I've called this meeting because recent events have made it clear that we need to discuss our family relationships more honestly. Mom, Michael interrupted, We want you to know that we all feel bad about your birthday. We should have prioritized better, and we're sorry." Dorothy nodded acknowledgement but didn't accept the apology. "Michael, the birthday was just a symptom of a larger problem. The problem is that you've all learned to treat me as if my feelings and needs are less important than yours." "That's not true," Jennifer protested. "We love you. We just have busy lives, and sometimes scheduling conflicts happen." "Jennifer," Dorothy said, opening the folder in front of her, "according to your social media posts, you and Emma went shopping after her college interview on my birthday. The interview, you said, made it impossible to attend my dinner." Jennifer's face flushed red as she realized her social media activity had been monitored. "That was just, we were already out and—" "You made a choice," Dorothy said simply. "The interview ended at 1 p.m. My dinner was at 2 p.m. You chose shopping over spending time with me, then lied about the reason." The room fell silent as Jennifer struggled to find an explanation that didn't make her behavior look exactly as selfish as it was. "Now," Dorothy continued, "let's discuss the financial aspects of our relationships, since money seems to be the only language that gets your attention." She gestured to the folders in front of each child. "Please open your folders. You'll find a comprehensive summary of the financial support I've provided each of you over the past 5 years." The sound of papers rustling was followed by stunned silence as her children processed the documentation of Dorothy's extensive financial contributions to their lives. The numbers were larger than any of them had realized, and seeing them compiled in spreadsheet format made the scope of their dependence undeniable. "Patricia," Dorothy said, "your folder shows $238,000 in loans, guarantees, and subsidies for your business. How much of that have you repaid?" Patricia's voice was barely above a whisper. I was planning to start repayment once the business got more established. It's been 3 years, and your business is quite successful according to your marketing materials. Yet you've never offered repayment or even acknowledgement of my investment." Dorothy turned to Stephen. "Stephen, your folder shows $95,000 in various assistance, including $15,000 for gambling debts. Did you really think I didn't know why you needed that emergency loan last spring?" Stephen couldn't meet her eyes. The casual assumption that he could deceive his mother about his destructive habits had been shattered by her detailed record-keeping. "The point of this exercise," Dorothy continued, "isn't to shame you for accepting help. The point is to help you understand that your comfortable lives are built on my continued generosity. Generosity that you've learned to take for granted." Michael found his voice first. "Mom, we're grateful for everything you've done. We just didn't realize you were keeping such detailed records." "I keep detailed records of everything, Michael. That's how I built the wealth that supports all of you. But gratitude isn't just an emotion, it's demonstrated through behavior. And your behavior suggests that you see my support as your entitlement rather than my choice." The meeting was about to take a turn that would change their family dynamics forever, and Dorothy could see in their faces that they were beginning to understand the precarious nature of their comfortable assumptions. Dorothy reached into her briefcase and withdrew a final document that made her children's folders look insignificant by comparison. The thick legal document bore the letterhead of Morrison, Keller and Associates, Denver's most prestigious estate planning firm. The weight of the bound pages seemed to draw all the oxygen from the room as Dorothy placed it deliberately in the center of the table. "This," Dorothy said with quiet authority, "is my current will and estate plan, updated as of last month." The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Her children's eyes fixed on the document with the intensity of people suddenly realizing that their entire future hinged on a conversation they'd walked into unprepared. The financial support documentation had been uncomfortable, but this was existential. "Michael," Dorothy continued, "according to this document, you stand to inherit approximately $3.2 million in assets, investments, and property. Jennifer, your inheritance is valued at $3.1 million. Patricia, despite your business success built on my investment, you're set to receive $2.9 million. Stephen, your share is $2.8 million. The numbers hung in the air like thunderclaps. Dorothy's children had known she was comfortable, but they'd never imagined the true scope of their mother's wealth. The totals she'd just recited represented life-changing money, enough to pay off mortgages, fund children's educations, ensure comfortable retirements, and provide financial security for generations. That's... Michael's voice cracked as he attempted to process the magnitude of what he'd just learned. Mom, we had no idea you had that kind of money. Of course you didn't, Dorothy replied evenly. You never asked about my finances except when you needed something from them. You assumed I was a comfortable retiree, not a wealthy woman who built a multi-million-dollar investment portfolio while you were busy taking me for granted. Jennifer's face had gone pale. Mom, this changes everything. We never would have... if you'd known I was wealthy, you would have treated me better. Dorothy's question cut through Jennifer's stammering with surgical precision. So your respect for me is conditional on my net worth? The silence that followed was deafening. Dorothy had cornered them in a logical trap of their own making. Either they admitted that money would have changed their behavior, proving their love was conditional, or they had to acknowledge that they'd treated a wealthy, generous mother terribly out of pure selfishness. That's not what I meant, Jennifer backtracked desperately. I think it's exactly what you meant, Dorothy said calmly. And it's exactly the problem with how you've all learned to see me. You've reduced me to my utility in your lives, rather than treating me as a person deserving of basic consideration. Patricia, who'd been unusually quiet since seeing her financial dependence documented, finally spoke up. Mom, what are you saying? Are you threatening to cut us out of your will because of a birthday dinner? The question revealed Patricia's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. She still thought this was about the birthday, not about decades of accumulated disrespect that the birthday had simply crystallized. Patricia, this isn't about one dinner. This is about 4 adult children who've learned to extract maximum benefit from our relationship, while providing minimum consideration in return. The birthday was just the moment I stopped pretending otherwise. Dorothy opened the will to a page she'd bookmarked with a yellow sticky note. This document was written under the assumption that my children would mature into people worthy of significant inheritance. It assumes you'd use this wealth responsibly, gratefully, and in ways that honor the family values that built it. She looked around the table at 4 faces that ranged from panicked to calculating. Recent evidence suggests those assumptions may have been optimistic. Stephen, whose gambling debts made him the most financially vulnerable, leaned forward with desperate intensity. Mom, we can change. We can be better. Just tell us what you want from us. The plea might have been touching, if it hadn't been so transparently motivated by financial self-interest. Dorothy had finally gotten her children's attention, but only by threatening their inheritance prospects. Stephen, the fact that you're asking what I want from you proves you don't understand the problem. For 40 years, I've been telling you what I wanted through my actions: respect, consideration, gratitude, and genuine family connection. You've ignored those messages because there were no consequences for ignoring them. Dorothy stood and walked to her office, returning with a second legal document. This one was thinner but carried equal weight. This is a revised estate plan I had prepared yesterday. It distributes my entire estate to charitable organizations that serve families, support education, and help people build better lives. The sound of sharp intakes of breath filled the room. Dorothy had just announced that she was considering disinheriting all of them in favor of charity. The Denver Children's Hospital would receive $4 million for pediatric cancer research. Dorothy continued with the detached tone of someone reading a grocery list. The Colorado Education Foundation would get $3 million for scholarships for first-generation college students. The local food bank would receive $2 million for facility expansion. $3 million would go to Habitat for Humanity to build homes for families who actually appreciate what they receive. Michael's composure cracked completely. You can't be serious. That's our inheritance. That's money Dad helped build, money that belongs to this family. Michael, your father built a successful construction business worth perhaps $400,000 when he died. I transformed that into a $12 million portfolio through investment strategies you never bothered to understand or appreciate. This money belongs to me, and I can distribute it however I choose. The distinction was crucial and devastating. Dorothy had just revealed that the bulk of their inheritance wasn't family money they'd earned through birthright. It was wealth she'd created through her own skill and effort. But we're your children, Jennifer protested, tears beginning to flow. Doesn't that mean anything? Being my children means you had every opportunity to earn this inheritance through character, gratitude, and genuine love, Dorothy replied. Instead, you chose entitlement, ingratitude, and conditional affection. The charitable organizations I'm considering have demonstrated more appreciation for my contributions than my own family has. Patricia's business instincts kicked in as she tried to salvage the situation. Mom, if this is about appreciation, we can change that. We can be more attentive, more grateful. We can make time for family dinners and celebrations. Patricia, you're describing a transaction. You'll provide attention and gratitude in exchange for inheritance. That's not family love. That's prostitution of emotion. The harsh characterization hit its mark. Patricia recoiled as if she'd been slapped, finally understanding how her calculated approach to family relationships appeared from Dorothy's perspective. Here's what's going to happen, Dorothy said, returning to her seat with the authority of someone who held all the cards. I'm going to spend the next month observing your behavior, not your words, not your promises, but your actual choices and actions. She gestured to the revised estate plan. This charitable distribution will be executed unless I see genuine evidence that you've learned to value our relationship for its own sake, rather than for what you can extract from it. What kind of evidence? Stephen asked, his voice small. Stephen, if you have to ask that question, you've already failed the test. People who genuinely care about family relationships don't need instructions on how to demonstrate care. Dorothy stood, signaling that the meeting was over. You have 30 days to show me who you really are when the stakes matter. Use that time wisely. As her children filed out of the house in stunned silence, Dorothy felt the deep satisfaction that comes from finally speaking truth to people who'd grown comfortable with comfortable lies. For the first time in decades, her children would have to genuinely consider her feelings rather than simply managing her expectations. 6 months later, Dorothy Hansen sat in the renovated children's wing of Denver General Hospital, watching young patients benefit from the cancer research equipment her donation had funded. The final estate plan had indeed been executed, with her entire fortune distributed to organizations that understood the value of generosity. Her children had tried, briefly, to demonstrate the appreciation and attention they thought she wanted. But their efforts had been transparently calculated, motivated by inheritance anxiety rather than genuine affection. The damage to their relationships had been too fundamental to repair with superficial behavioral changes. Dorothy felt no regret as she watched children receive treatment that her money had made possible. She'd learned that some people would only value what they couldn't take for granted, and her children had proven they preferred to take rather than to give. The birthday they'd ignored had cost them everything. But for Dorothy, it had been the gift of clarity about what real family love actually looked like, and where to find it when your own family failed to provide it. Her legacy would serve others for generations, rather than enabling the entitled selfishness that had cost her children the greatest inheritance of all, a mother's love freely given and gratefully received. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.